Hello, this is Dennis Sanders. Today, we talk about faith practices and neighboring practices. This is episode 155 of Church and Main. Hello, and welcome to Church and Main, the podcast that's the intersection of faith and modern life. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. Church and Main is a podcast that looks at issues affecting the church and how those issues also influence the larger society. You can learn more about the podcast, especially listening to past episodes, by checking us out at churchandmain.org or at churchandmain.substack.com, and consider subscribing. Well, if you've followed this podcast for a while now, you know that I'm interested in how the local congregation faces a rapidly changing world. Churches are in crisis, and there is a drive to out-innovate and out-program the competition in order to be relevant in the 21st century. The problem with this is that it really doesn't work, and it makes the congregation the center of our faith instead of, God. Earlier this year, I interviewed theologian Andrew Root, who draws from the work of Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor. And Root tells Christians in congregations today that it's not the next big program that matters. It's really resonance, sitting and waiting for God to show up in our faith communities, in our relationships, and in our lives. Today's guest is also asking us to listen to God and to listen to the communities where our congregations are located. Nicholas Tangen is the Director for Faith Practices and Neighboring Practices for the Minneapolis Area Synod of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. In this position, he brings together faith practice with the practice of being a good neighbor. To give you an example of where he is coming from, you may want to see what he did before he came to the Minneapolis Area Synod. Before his current position, he served as Minister for Faith and Community at University Lutheran Church of Hope in Minneapolis, where he redesigned the children's ministry curriculum to focus on fostering spiritual practices in the home and social transformation. He also facilitated Bible studies with a lens towards social change and current events, and organized intergenerational activities that formed relationships and community in creative expressions of spirituality. In addition to all of this, he also led efforts to address food insecurity needs in the Dinkytown neighborhood of Minneapolis by planning, launching, and operating the Dinkytown Farmers Market, and participated in the Synod's community organizing trainings. Nicholas is a native of Rosemont, Minnesota, and he has a Master of Arts in Leadership from the United Theological Seminary in the Twin Cities. If you're a pastor or a lay leader of a congregation that's trying to find better ways to connect with the surrounding community, this is an episode for you. So let's listen to this interview with Nicholas Tangen. Well, Nick, it's good to have you joining us on this podcast today.
Thanks, Dennis. I appreciate the invitation, and glad to be with you.
I think what I want to do is just kind of start off is knowing a little bit about you, where you grew up, and kind of your church background, and then learn a little bit about your role with the Minneapolis Area Synod.
Yeah, I love it. Um, yeah, so my name's Nick Tangen. I'm the director of faith practices and neighboring practices at the Minneapolis Area Synod. I grew up in Rosemount, Minnesota, so just south of the Twin Cities here, but most of my family's from northern Minnesota.
Okay.
And we were not very churchy people when I was a kid. My mom was what you might call a recovering Catholic, and so wasn't so sure about church. But there was this like 3 year period where my mom got really interested in church, and so wanted us to go to church. And I think we went to just about every denomination in that 3 year span, and
Wow.
just trying out every church we could find. And they just never really stuck. And eventually my family kind of pulled back a little bit again. But it was in my sophomore year of high school. I was in a very terrible pop punk band. And we were looking for places to play. And the local Lutheran church said, well, you can come and play some of your songs so long as you play the youth group music afterwards. And we thought, well, great, free gig. So that was my first connection to the Lutheran church. And there were some gaps in between there. But really, the Lutheran church has been kind of my home for quite a few years now. And I've been working in congregations and now at the Synod with our bishop, doing community engagement work for about 10 years. So, which makes me feel so old, but it's true. And I'm trying to figure out how to navigate that reality now. So, yeah, and do you want me to say just a little bit about the project itself?
Yeah, you talk about community engagement. And so how would you define that? What does that look like?
Yeah, there's a lot of ways to think about community engagement. There's in the church, we often think in terms of service with the neighborhood, right? So we might think about what are the things we can do for our neighbors, or what's kind of the charity projects we have, or things like that. There's also community organizing, which is building power, getting decision makers to say yes to something even though they might not want to, and shifting policy and change. My kind of intervention, the place where I like to spend a lot of time, is more in that kind of relational space. It's about how do we embody what it means to be good and faithful neighbors. And so it's focused on those kind of small, simple ways that we relate to one another outside the walls of our church. And so for me, this project that I'm a part of, Faith and Neighboring Practices, through the Minneapolis Area Synod, we're bringing churches together, 12 to 15 churches in regional cohorts, and helping them think about those small, simple practices, the small things we do consistently over time that put us in connection with our neighbor in relational ways, in ways that are not transactional, in ways that are not power over, or but are rather kind of walking alongside and accompaniment.
So, and what does that look like in a congregation? And I think I can back up and kind of give you a little bit of context, because as congregations, and especially these days, many of us don't necessarily live in the neighborhood that we're in. So we're coming in from a place. I know in my own background we have what I would call kind of regional churches. So you have people kind of coming in from everywhere. What does it look like to kind of have relations in that neighborhood, to kind of, when you don't necessarily maybe live in that neighborhood, but yet want to be a part of it?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's one of the biggest challenges, I think, for community engagement, because for so long, it really was common that people went to church in the neighborhood where they lived, right? And for a lot of years in the U.S. And like you're saying, that's less likely now, or less common now. And you have a lot of people coming from all over the place, which means that there's a question of self-interest, right? It's hard to know what is my self-interest in this neighborhood if I don't shop here, my kids don't go to school here, I don't vote here, right? And I think a couple of things. One is that I think um, God has called us to be church in place. I think
Mm-hmm.
that matters, right? That it's not an accident that we are church in the places we are church, and I truly believe that. And so I do think it's a part of our baptismal and our vocational call to be the neighbor in the places where God has asked us to be. Um, and what that means then is that it means that for those of us who don't live in that immediate neighborhood, we have to be increasingly intentional about things we might take for granted if we lived in the community. So, one of the things we ask our congregations to do regularly is to walk in the neighborhood, to be outside, walking the community,
Mm-hmm.
getting a sense of the layout and the streets and the small businesses and the people outside. Part of that is just being visible and being seen and seeing your neighbor. I think all the time about, like, when I first moved into my house here, um, how much trust was built in those first few weeks just by seeing my neighbor a little
Mm-hmm.
bit, and then you kind of like slowly start to, hey, hi, how's it going, and then build up to a more meaningful relationship. And unfortunately now, especially if we are kind of regional churches, a lot of times our churches really only see us when we're walking from church to car. And so for
Mm-hmm.
them, they're thinking, I don't know if the church has an interest in the neighborhood because we just never see them here.
Hmm.
So that's one
Yeah.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And I think one of the interesting things about your title, and this has
Hmm.
always been fascinating, is that it's faith and neighboring practices.
Hmm.
Where does the faith part come in?
Yeah.
And then where the neighboring? And it seems like you're kind of merging faith practices,
Hmm.
then practices with getting to know the neighbor. How do those
Yeah.
two kind of come together?
Absolutely. When I was working in churches doing community engagement work, I was also doing faith formation.
Mm-hmm.
And part of what I was always trying to do was to bring these two often separate disciplines together, because I think they really do function as two sides of the same coin, that they're
Mm-hmm.
not separate. I think in kind of church culture these days, at least in the churches that I spend time in, when we talk about faith formation, mostly what we mean is education, right? So we're going to
Mm-hmm.
have a classroom, bring folks together, we're going to talk about God. And then when we talk about neighboring or service, as outreach is usually what we mean, that's the kind of separate doing good deeds on behalf of our neighbors.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, though, when I reflected back on my own faith formation, it was those moments of encounter. It was those moments of seeing God at work in the community, in the gathering of people, in powerful connections in the neighborhood. Those were the places where I felt most formed in my own faith. And so we've
Mm-hmm.
said in this project, how can we develop um, uh, practices on both sides of this coin that help us to kind of see the neighborhood through this lens. And for us, we've settled into two disciplines that I think help us do that. One is asset-based community development. And so this is a way of looking at our neighborhood through a lens of gifts and strengths rather than needs. And then the second is contemplative spiritual practice. So a way of praying and deepening our relationship with God that is focused more on excuse me, more on listening rather than our own action or our own speaking.
Mm-hmm.
And we've really found that those two disciplines, again, just hold this posture of listening really carefully and seem to really work together. And so, when we have folks doing 3 months of neighborhood listening, so they're maybe holding, holding gatherings in their community, and then kind of asking neighbors questions about the neighborhood or what's kind of top of mind for them. We're also asking them to pay attention to where they see God at work in that interaction. It's that
Mm-hmm.
kind of reflective process. So yeah, maybe that's an initial piece. That's kind of how we see those two things living together.
Yeah, and I did have read a little bit about your writings
Hmm.
on asset based community development,
Hmm.
and that is an interesting way of looking at things.
Hmm.
Because I think normally sometimes when I've heard about how we engage communities, it's like, what are the needs?
Exactly.
which is understandable, but it
Hmm.
could also be, I don't want to say condescending is not the best word for it, but
It's
it can
fair.
be not listening to the
Yes.
community as
Yeah.
much or giving them some sense of agency.
Exactly.
And so this is kind of an interesting way of looking at it is
Hmm.
um, because I think we're so engaged in wanting to do something and
Yes.
not always to sit and to listen.
Yes. I think there's one of the things I've noticed in my own work is I think in the mainline church especially, I think we've adopted a lot of nonprofit culture. And so we
Mm-hmm.
tend to see ourselves as organizations that have a job to do, and we have things we're supposed to get done. We're problem solvers. That's one of the ways we think about the neighborhood. But what ends up happening then is we put ourselves into a position where we become service providers, and our neighbors then are recipients.
Mm-hmm.
And it means we're always looking at our neighbors through the lens of a deficiency. So we see them as homeless, we see them as poor, we see, right, instead of as the people who have gifts and strengths that have been given to them by God to contribute to the common good. And so it's a big shift to say God is actually up to something really incredible in our neighborhoods already. And what if, as the church, our job is to go out, find where that's happening, and tell that story, and then help to amplify it so that folks feel like they have a chance to actually contribute to their own neighborhood and community rather than always having to receive from a professional or some service institution.
So, what is that looking like, kind of in concrete?
Hmm.
I for one, I don't know if you do, but I live in North Minneapolis,
Hmm.
so that is an area where there are a lot of what you would say are problems,
Hmm. Yep.
but there are also lots of agencies and community groups and
Hmm.
other people engaged in that area. So it's not
Yep.
without any help.
Hmm.
Um, are there churches, and I know that there are especially ELCA churches in that area.
Hmm.
Are there examples of how they are working with those groups that are already on the ground, and what does that look
Hmm.
like that they're listening and engaging those groups and people who live there?
Yeah. Yeah, I think for a lot of the churches that I'm working with right now, they're still at a space of discovering their neighborhood. I think in a
Okay.
lot of ways they've been so removed from the community that they just really don't know the neighborhood at all. And so we're
Mm,
spending a lot of time just getting folks out into the community. Like I said, walking the neighborhood, um, meeting some of the stakeholders and the immediate neighbors, having some intentional conversations, and starting to familiarize themselves again.
hmm
Um, but there are churches all over the country that are doing some of this really incredible asset based work. There's a book I would really recommend, and a pastor I would really commend, named Mike Mather. He's a pastor out in Colorado, but when he was in Indianapolis, his congregation started using this asset based lens for their work, and he told this great story about how they had a food shelf in their church. And usually when folks would come to the food shelf, the first thing you ask is this kind of litany of questions. Who lives in your house? What's your income? How often do you have to come here? And he said he realized that we were basically asking people when they came to the food shelf, how poor are you? And
mm,
so he said, we decided to shift that up and instead started asking, what are you good at? What are you passionate about? What is something you know how to do well enough that you could teach someone else? And one of the examples he gave was an elderly woman who came in and she said, I love to cook. And Pastor Mike Mather said, prove it, and asked her to come and cook at the church for the staff. And she did, and they paid her for it. And over some time, they started to encourage her to think of herself as the church caterer. And so whenever organizations were coming to meet at the church, she would cook for them,
hmm.
and then that organization would pay her for it.
Okay.
And after a couple of years, she was actually able to open her own business, open her own restaurant, because she had built so much good word of mouth through this practice and this process. And the thing that was powerful to me is Mike Mather said, he said, it would have always been true that this woman had this gift, this skill, but if no one had asked her or invited her to share it, none of this would have been possible. And so he said it was just that small shift that kind of changed their sense of what it meant to be neighbor and changed her life. So that's
Wow.
an example that has been really meaningful for me.
Hmm.
Hmm.
So, if one of the other things that I think in thinking about this in the community engagement is that you tend to think about this in an urban setting.
Hmm.
Of course, not all churches are in
No.
cities. There are churches in suburbs. What does
Hmm.
this look like in a suburban setting?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting. I think suburban churches tend to be more of the outlier even than rural or urban churches. I think
Hmm.
rural and urban churches tend to have actually a lot in common in some of those dynamics. Um, but I think part of the suburban church um, piece is, well, one is that suburbs tend to have significantly less public gathering space. They might have some parks or
Hmm.
something like that, but they don't have the same kind of attachment to public gathering space. And so I think for a lot of congregations, it's thinking of themselves as conveners, using the church and the asset of that property as a place to gather neighbors and bring neighbors together to start to build some of that connection and that relationship. I grew up in a suburb, started as a rural suburb, but grew up in Rosemount. And I
Hmm.
remember, we maybe knew the neighbors right next door to us who shared a fence with us, but it was tough to know the neighbors much further out. Um, there aren't sidewalks in the neighborhood where I grew up. There aren't those kind of walking spaces. So it takes a particular kind of creativity, I think, to get out and find those ways to engage. But I think they're out there.
Hmm.
But I think again, it's always for me. This work comes down to the small, simple things we often take for granted. I think it's things like table fellowship. It's things like intentional conversations one to one. It's changing the conversation so that instead of asking, what does our neighborhood need or where is our neighborhood hurting, we're asking, what does our neighborhood have? What are the strengths? What can our neighborhood do together? What's the possibility? But I think it's also just familiarizing yourself with those 8 to 10 neighbors closest to you. If a
Hmm.
church could spend years just developing the relationships with the folks on their block, and that would be plenty of work for a church in the suburbs, I think.
How important do you think is the concept of place,
Hmm.
especially for the church? Because I think we live in this age with social media and things online. Obviously, we're doing this
Hmm.
conversation online.
Yep.
Is the sense I sometimes hear at times that physical places don't matter,
Mm.
and but we are still physical beings,
Hmm.
and we there are still the physical world is out there. So, um, how much does that matter, and why does it matter, especially in this day of when we do so much stuff virtually?
Yeah. Yeah. I think place matters supremely.
Hmm.
I think theologically, I start with the incarnation, right?
Hmm.
God takes on flesh in Jesus, and not generic flesh. He takes on particular flesh, right? Of a particular person among a particular people in a particular place. And I think that continues to be true for each of us, that we are called to be the church in a particular place among a particular people. I also think that Jesus shows up for us in the face of our neighbor in that particularity, which I think is key. Other On the other side of this, also, neighborhoods are the context for so much of what really matters in our lives. A lot of our sense of public safety starts locally, starts in the
Mm-hmm.
neighborhood. Health and wellness is largely a neighborhood concern. We often think about healthcare, but where you live matters significantly more to your health outcomes than whatever healthcare service you end up with. Things
Mm-hmm.
like the raising and formation of children; those are largely local issues. And food is another one, right? Food is essential to who we are. I think about North Minneapolis, is a prime example of a place that is consistently struggling to find access to good and healthy food. Right? It's. I know. I think was it the Aldi that
Mm-hmm.
just closed in North Minneapolis and lost access to one of
Yeah.
the last grocery stores, right? So I think that's the big those big things for our regular daily lives happen locally. And so I think place really does matter. And I get really nervous when the church takes its foot out of the neighborhood, because I think then that tends to be a direction more towards an individualized sense of faith and looking more for affinities rather than the neighborhood you've been gifted to be a part of, right? Which is a little
Mm-hmm.
a little more like family, right? We don't get to choose our family, we don't get to choose our neighbors in the same way, and I think there's a gift in that, because if I'm only living within my homogenous little bubble that thinks the same way I think and acts the same way I think, I'm going to have a pretty small world and a pretty small sense of the human condition.
So, do you see that this kind of way of looking at the community and the church within the community? Is this something that is people are kind of catching on to, and our churches and especially middle judicatories really kind of engaging in this approach?
I think so. I mean, I think I've often heard that question. People have posed this question. If the church closed its doors today, would the neighborhood notice that you were gone?
Mm-hmm.
And I think for a lot of churches and judicatories in COVID, that question was answered. The churches closed their doors, and for a lot of churches, they had to realize that the answer was no. The neighborhood didn't notice or didn't care that the church had closed its doors. And I think that was a bit of both a wake up call and an identity crisis for some churches who realized, whoa, okay, we thought we were maybe connected in this community, and it turns out maybe we weren't. But I think also what they're finding too is that the churches that have a sense of aliveness, that what we say is vitality or whatever that might be, tend to be those churches that are deeply rooted in place. They're the churches that have a clear sense of their identity rooted here, that we've been called here. We're in relationship with the neighborhood. The neighborhood, in whatever ways we've built this relationship, can count on us, and we can count on the community. There's trust there, and so I've seen this kind of place-based approach catching on all over the place, and so there are other organizations doing similar work, like the Riverside Innovation Hub at Augsburg University. There's the Parish Collective out on the West Coast that's doing some similar work. There are also, even here in the Twin Cities, I think they've changed their name now, but there was a group called Ace in the City, which is focused on placemaking and thinking
Mm-hmm.
about how we use church buildings locally. So I do think it's catching on. I feel like there's kind of a movement happening right now for the church to attend again to the small, to the simple, and to the local. And I think that's exciting, because I think when we start to get a sense of what's actually possible just in those few blocks around our neighborhood, I think we're going to continue to just be surprised by what God is already up to.
How hard do you think it is for, especially for churches? And I think I've heard this before, and it's to basically be still and listen, listening for God, listening for neighbor.
Yeah.
because I think that so much of our churches today are designed for
Mhm.
action instead
Yes.
of contemplation.
Yes.
Um, and as a pastor, I totally
Hmm.
feel that pull of trying to do
Yeah.
stuff. Um, how hard has that
Hmm.
been? Do you, in your kind of being in your position, how hard do you think it
Hmm.
has been for churches to really sit still and listen for
Hmm.
God and listen to the community?
Yeah. Yeah, it's tough. I tell you, I mean, it's not just church culture. I think it's American culture broadly is we're a culture of busyness and outcomes and silence and stillness is like death. And, it's just, it's tough. What I find though is that the hardest part is the invitation, you know,
Mm-hmm.
once you invite folks, that first invitation into silence or sitting down, you can see people just like, ah. But if you can get folks to take a moment and to sit down and pay attention, I think it starts to take hold, and people start to find the rest that I think they're often desperately looking for, and the
Mm.
permission to rest that they feel they never get. And I think I feel this for pastors all the time, and for those of us working in the church, right? It feels like we don't have the permission often, or don't feel like we have the permission to reflect on what God is calling us to in this moment. Instead, we have to always be ahead of it. What's the next thing? What's the next thing? Um, but I don't think that does us any good, because I think we're missing a lot of the goodness that's already around us because we're just not paying attention to it, you know? And I think, yeah, inviting folks, especially just to do some of that reflective work. One of my favorite questions to ask folks when we get together is, where have you seen God at work? That simple question, where it gets people to just kind of reflect back on the work they've done, the relationships they've had, and to pay attention for where God is. That small, simple question, I think people start to wake up to the fact that God has been present in and throughout all of what they've been about. But it's a tough ask in this culture, that is for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but if you can get them to take a seat and close their eyes and embrace a little bit of silence, I think they start to find, oh my gosh, this is exactly what my body and my spirit has been looking for some time.
Yeah, it's interesting. Hearing that reminds me of some of the things I've been reading from Andrew Root from
Hmm.
Luther Seminary. And a lot
Yeah.
of it is very similar, that
Hmm.
sometimes what we really, so much of it, especially when it's churches, as we're kind of dealing with decline, feels like
Hmm.
we have to do something, and that
Yes.
sometimes we need to just
Hmm.
sit.
Exactly.
And that's hard, I think, for us.
Very
I
hard.
think, especially as you said, as Americans, because
Hmm.
we've always been very much of an active people,
Yep.
and that has its good points.
Absolutely.
But sometimes you do just need to sit,
Yep.
because we can be moving so fast that we don't always
Mhm.
see the good that's around us. We don't really even sometimes see God
Exactly.
happening around us, and that,
Exactly.
yeah. And,
One of my favorite images for centering prayer, contemplative prayer, is to imagine ourselves sitting across the table from our beloved and just
mhm,
kind of taking God's presence in, and I think there's so much of that that's needed in the neighbor as well, right? And I think part of
mhm,
the effect of so much nonprofit culture in our churches is we want to move fast and we want to see results fast. But
mhm,
I think we all know deep down that relational work takes time. And community engagement, especially, is long term work. I mean, in some ways, it's generational work, and
mhm,
we're not going to accomplish all the things we want to accomplish in one church year. That's not going to happen. Which means we might be called to do less, but to do it more consistently, right? And I think I think if we take the time and give ourselves some permission to go slow, to go deep, and to focus on connection and relationship more than on outcomes and numbers. We usually gauge things by butts and pews and dollars in the coffers, and if instead we start to measure ourselves by the depth of our connection and the richness of our faith, I think that's a much healthier and a much more hopeful vision for church than what we often hold.
So one of the things that you kind of talked about before, and this is also where probably talking a little bit about, because I know that you have a background, I'm always going to get this word wrong, oblate,
Yeah.
Benedictine, oblate, is about contemplation in as a kind of a faith practice.
Yeah.
Why is that important? And how has that been important in your life? And how is that important in the life of the church?
Yeah. Yeah. I think, I was brought to the Benedictines partially because, in some ways, even though I had connections to the church when I was younger, I really didn't find myself kind of caught up by the gospel until I was older. I was in my 20s. And so I had a little bit of that convert zeal, and when I came to the church, I knew that something new had happened, right? Like I had been made new in some way, shape, or form. And I was looking for my church to help me understand, what does that mean for me now in my daily life? And often in my Lutheran Protestant church, that was not where we wanted to focus our attention. That was works, or something like that. And so I was drawn to the Benedictine community for that kind of Christian intentionality. And yeah, like you said, for Benedictines, especially Lectio Divina, contemplative, sacred reading of Scripture, a process of listening to the Word of God more than that kind of like analysis of the Word of God, which I think is so common within the Protestant Church, is core to who Benedictines are. I think the contemplation matters because of some of what we've already been saying, right? We struggle often to see where God is at work. And partially, I think that's because we just don't listen and we move forward at our own pace. It kind of makes me think about like when I lose my keys in my house and I start to get just so rapidly anxious about it, I start looking everywhere instead of just stopping to ask myself, where was the last place I saw them? And I'm never going to find them if I'm just running around the house all willy-nilly. But I think it's also that it's a belief that God is still speaking, that God is still saying something new and something transformational and something liberating now in this moment, not just 2,000 years ago, not just 500 years ago, but in this moment. And the invitation for us is to listen in relationship, I'd say, to Scripture and community. And I think those are always the guardrails of that contemplation. But to discern where and how God is calling us to be faithful people today, in this moment, now. So I think that's why I think it matters. But I think it also matters because contemplation is that space where we allow ourselves to be held by God. It's interesting. One of the things we noticed was the way we, in this project, it often looks like the way we approach God in prayer and the way we approach the neighbor in the neighborhood look very similar. We approach them both transactionally. So we show up and we say, hey, God, give me something, or let me give you something, my praise or thanksgiving, or hey, neighbor, let me give you something, charity or service, or give me something, come to church, come, give us your dollars. And I think the invitation instead is to say, what if we just sat with our neighbor and sat with God and took in the beauty and the giftedness and the contribution of that presence, I think we'd start to both see God a little bit differently. I think we'd start to see our neighbor a little bit differently. So yeah, that's kind of what's coming to mind for me right now.
One of the things I always remember from way back in seminary, and I preached
Hmm.
something about Job. Um, it's interesting about Job's friends, and the first
Just the
part of
best of
that,
friends, right?
the first part of it though, with they did actually do one thing right, and
Hmm.
that was at the beginning. They just sat with him. They
Yes.
didn't say anything, and
Yes.
it seems like that was a long, like days,
Yep.
um, and I've always remembered that. It was when
Hmm.
they said something that was when it became a problem.
Exactly.
But they, the beginning of it was just sitting with him, and there's
Exactly.
something important about that,
Hmm.
especially because I think our temptation is to just say something or do
Yeah.
something,
We want to
and
fix it.
yeah, and
Exactly.
sometimes you can't fix it,
Yep.
or at least it maybe that might not be what needs to be done at that time. Is
Exactly.
And again,
Yep.
that's hard
Oh
because
my
you
God.
want to
So
fix it, you want to
tough.
solve it.
Yes. Especially if you feel like, oh, I know what to do, then it's like,
Hmm.
oh my gosh, that's the hardest place to just take a step back and not offer advice, but instead, yeah, focus on connection instead. I remember this past summer, one of our congregations was hosting a community meal, and I went and was sitting at the table with this woman. She was there by herself, and we just started talking. And my intention was, I'm just gonna get curious. That's all I want to
Hmm.
do is just get curious. And so I kept asking her questions, and not like in an annoying way, but in a conversational way. And we found some connection. We're both originally our families are from northern Minnesota, so we started talking about hunting and fishing and all of that. And eventually, she started to open up as I got curious, and she told me about how during COVID she had lost both her husband and her son, and had just this really painful um, experience over the last couple of years. Um, and we just kept talking and talking, and she was able to kind of open up and say how much the community meal meant to her, because
Hmm.
she's living alone now, and this is the one time a week she's got someone to eat with. And we talked maybe for like an hour and a half, and it comes to a close, and she's not a member of a church, she's just in the neighborhood. We come to a close, they're starting to clean up, and she asked me, she said, hey, would it be okay if we prayed? And I was just like floored by that, right? It wasn't something that I asked for. It wasn't something that was part of a program or anything. It was just, it came naturally out of this conversation. She asked for it, and of course I was like, yes, please. And so we just ended our time together in prayer. And I was just struck by that that opportunity wouldn't emerge if instead of getting curious and listening, I was in this mindset of trying to solve her problems, or trying to give her advice, or direct her to somewhere else where she could get some services, or right. Instead, it was just in sitting with her, letting her share her story, asking her to share her story, that connection was kind of made. And I think that's the practice of contemplation, right? Is that posture of curiosity and listening.
Do you think one of the problems, because you talked a lot about how churches can fall into kind of nonprofit culture,
Hmm.
is a problem of ecclesiology, that we don't really understand who we are as a church, as a
Yep.
community of faith?
100%. Yeah, no, I think that's tough. I think, especially, so I'm a layperson in the church, and it took me a lot of years to realize that I was being called as a layperson to serve the church, right? Um,
Hmm.
and I think, um, in some ways, the pattern, um, is my own opinion. The pattern we see in the neighborhood of kind
Hmm.
of professional service provider and recipient often shows up in our churches as well, where we tend to think of our clergy as having the service to provide, and the lay people as the recipients. And I think that's a self-fulfilling circle, right? I think as lay people, we often ask our pastors to be the end all be all, provide all things, do all things. And I think vice versa. I think that goes back and forth. And I think so. I think in one way, part of that ecclesiological question is about um, the vocation of each individual person within the church, including and especially lay people, thinking about for the church to be the neighbor, that can't just be the clergy person, right? It means that each and every one of us has to embody that culture and that vocation of neighboring, of being the neighbor. Um, but I also think it's broadly that kind of sense of mission. What are we called to as the church? Are we called to save souls, or are we called to be political actors, or are we? And it's always this kind of either or mentality, or we want the one silver bullet. But I think faithful discipleship looks like a messy, beautiful blend of all those things. But that's rooted in the neighbor, that is always paying attention um, to where and how God is speaking a new word in the face and the expression and the experience of our neighbor, and now how are we called to respond to it?
One of the things in a recent blog post you write, you brought up the parable, and I just preached on this myself recently, of
Hmm.
the weeds, wheat and tares,
Yeah.
and you related that to how basically related it to your work and to
Hmm.
how churches kind of can respond in community. Would you
Hmm.
mind sharing that? Because I think that was an important way of how you look at this, using parables, and I've always been a big sucker for the parables. So,
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this was um, yeah, the problem solving, the kind of
yeah.
lens on problem solving. Yeah. Yeah, I think one thing I've noticed, especially in kind of like progressive mainline churches, is is an obsession with the problem, right? And
Hmm.
we tend to look at the neighborhood, or we look at our own church, especially through the lens of what's broken and what's failing. And part of what I noticed in that was the way that obsession steps beyond, avoids, neglects to look at the goodness that is all around us, both within our church and within our neighborhoods. And yeah, that reminded me so quickly of that parable of the landowner who goes out and he sows this good seed, expecting that it's all going to grow up beautifully. And in the night, an enemy comes out and sows weeds, and and then his servants come up to him and say, all right, you've got all these weeds here. Do you want us to go out and we'll start pulling them up, right? And for me, that sounds so much like the mentality of the mainline church right now, right? Let's find all the weeds, and we're going to pluck them all up. And if we do that, then what's left will be just all goodness, right? Um, and instead, the landowner wisely, I think, says, I think it's better to pay attention to the health and well being, the goodness of the good seed we sowed. If we spend all of our time going out and pulling up the weeds, we're likely to pull up the good seed, the good plants that are going to produce fruit just as much. Um, and so I think for us that there's some wisdom in that to say, and this is the basic premise of asset-based community development again too, is to say, instead of focusing on what's wrong, let's focus on what's strong. And if
Mm.
we put our attention there, um, I have faith that actually will produce fruit, and fruit on fruit on fruit. Where if we focus only on what's on the weeds, on what's wrong, I think we're likely to pull up and damage some of what's producing good fruit. That doesn't mean that we ignore the weeds. It
Hmm.
doesn't mean that when they start to overtake, that we don't have some interventions, right? And it's not a suggestion to avoid toxicity or evil or those kinds of things. Instead, it's to say
Hmm.
the best way, to address those concerns, or the best way to overcome the weeds, is actually to grow healthy, good producing plants. Yeah, so that's kind of what I heard in that parable.
So, kind of wrapping things up, is what word would you have to give to churches out there, especially after post COVID, that are trying to kind of figure
Mm-hmm.
out what they're doing?
Yeah,
What kind of word of hope can you give them?
yeah. I think in a lot of ways, COVID gave us an unintentional jubilee, a fast. We got to let the fields lie untoiled, untended, and now we have this space to really decide who we want to be again. There's some freedom, I think, in there's lots of pain. I don't want to suggest that COVID was a good thing, but coming out of that, I think there's some freedom for us to really focus on who we feel we are being called to be as church. And I think the word of hope is that um, God continues to show up in the small, simple things that build community.
Mm-hmm.
And the pressure we often feel to do the pressure we often feel to do the grand thing, the big programmatic project thing. I think we have permission in this moment to set that down, because I think COVID reminded us and taught us that fellowship matters, that relationship matters, that a sense of belonging and care and concern matters, and that the essentials matter: food and safety and a sense of community really, really matter. And I think additionally, when churches focus their attention on those small, simple things, I think they see a larger sense of God's action than they might expect to see when we attend there. So I think the word of hope for me, the thing that has been most hopeful for me, is that God continues to show up in the small, simple things and continues to call us there as well. And I think that's permission for church. Don't busy ourselves with the bigness that we think we're supposed to attend to, and instead focus on depth rather than breadth, focus on relationships
Mm-hmm.
rather than numbers, and trust that God is going to do something incredible among the people and the places where you've been called to live and worship.
If people want to find out about you, learn more about you,
Mhm.
where can they go?
Yeah, you can check out my website, which is just my name, nicholastangen.com. So I write pretty regularly there. And then I also have a podcast called At the Table, Christian Community for the Common Good. And so having conversations just like this about how the Christian church can continue to be a force for good and for the common good in the neighborhood. So yeah, you can check me out there.
Okay, cool. Well, Nick, thank you so much for taking the time to talk. I think that this was very important. It's
Thanks.
always a reminder sometimes that in our life, sometimes you don't always have to be busy. Sometimes it's about
Amen.
sitting and listening to
Hmm.
God and our neighbor. So thank you
Yes.
so much.
Thank you, Dennis. I appreciate it. Thanks for the invitation.
All right. Take care.
See ya.
Well, thanks so much for taking the time to listen. Check out the show notes for how to read some of the articles that Nicholas has written online, and also a link to his podcast, At the Table. That's it for this episode of Church in Maine. Remember to rate and review this episode on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to this podcast. That helps others find it. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. Thank you again for listening. Take care, Godspeed, and I will see you very soon.